Okay, we're a little more pressed for time today, so I'm going to get right to it. It may go fairly quickly, especially in the regular worship hour. Jeremy, I knew him. He'd visit us at Edwards Lake way back when I was there 2002 to 2007, and then his family kind of migrated out to California for a while. They were at the Folsom congregation in Sacramento area. The last time I did this series was in Folsom, and when I did this particular lesson, sitting in the audience was Rich Maurer, who got some graduate degree work done at Yale in medieval history, and I was a little bit intimidated doing this lesson on the Middle Ages. But I have talked with Rich a lot, and he was gracious enough to translate the big sheepskin Latin work that you see in the display area, and that's Rich Maurer's work. There were some abbreviations in Latin that I wasn't sure about, and some other things, and a very gracious fellow brother in Christ as well. I have a fascination with the medieval age. I'm not by any means a medieval scholar like he is, and I am married to a German wife who has taken me through a lot of really interesting places in her native Germany. She and I both speak a little bit of French, and we've been in the Loire Valley, where you have castles and cathedrals and cobblestone streets and a lot of fascination with the damsels in distress and knights in shining armor and all of that. We have euphoric memory of that period of time because of the good things, but it was also a brutal period of time in so many respects. And so coming off the heels of what we looked at last night, we talked a little bit about Bart Ehrman and his attacks on the Bible, and yet in light of all of that, he says at the end of his book, misquoting Jesus, of his mentor, Bruce Metzger, who had a higher view of the New Testament than he did, if he and I were put in a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement on what we think the original text of the New Testament probably looked like, there would be very few points of disagreement, maybe one or two dozen places out of many thousands. Daniel Wallace of Dallas Theological Seminary, who debated Bart Ehrman 3 times, closed all 3 debates on that quotation right there. And he had nothing to say, Daniel Wallace says, because it was his own words. So in a moment of honesty, one of the world's greatest skeptics is admitting that we can reconstruct the New Testament as it was given. Most of the textual variations in the manuscripts are very minor. In fact, if there's one category that comes up more than any other, it's minor spelling differences. Here's an example. 2 Peter 1:1, there are some very good manuscripts that spell Peter's name Simeon, and other Greek manuscripts that would give his name as Simon or Simon. That's a spelling variation. You get into the Middle Ages, John Wycliffe's name is spelled a number of different ways. William Tyndale's last name, a number of different ways. And so it's nothing that is meaningful and viable at the same time. Part of the material evidence in the scrolls, we alluded to some of this yesterday. You have writing materials as artifacts themselves. You have P72, the close of 1 Peter and the opening of 2 Peter. You can see this very page in the exhibit area. Codex versus the scroll, the writing style, the pinpricks were used for line justification so that the scribes could write out very carefully. You could thumb through, you could probably see this in the exhibit about as well with John Wycliffe's translation into English, where you actually see the lines underneath the words. So you could go back to the exhibit area and actually see the lines, but some of the other documents you might be able to do that as well. You see little corrections by the editors, sometimes marginal statements, sometimes little corrections above a word. The sacred names, we talked about that. You have marginal doodles and little scribal doodles at the end of a book showing that it's the end. You also have something that we'll call line count, stikoi in the Greek. For instance, in this particular manuscript, you have at the end, you have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and so on, and then the number of lines. And what that represents is so much pay for so many lines, which means that you actually have professional scribes doing some of this, and they're taking stock of how many lines they've written out. Now I want you to think about that. You're dealing with the expense of handwriting a manuscript rather than putting it through the printing press. It doesn't come around until 1455 or so. And animal skin. A document with animal skin may involve many, many animals that have to be slaughtered. And then you pay a professional scribe. And even in the early days, when they were still writing on papyrus, in some cases, some of these very early manuscripts were done by professional scribes. And they had to get copies and copies and copies and copies out there very rapidly. Someone had to pay for that. I just want to put that bug in your ear. This was not necessarily cheap, but someone paid that price. Someone was making a sacrifice to get the Word of God out. And so we looked at this yesterday, marginal comment in the Codex Vaticanus. On the side, this is embedded just into the margin, and an editor says, "Fool and knave, can't you leave the old reading alone and not alter it?" So they really wanted to get it right. You have this underlying motivation of just copying the text and not messing with it. But my favorite example comes from the Middle Ages, and it's this one, where you have this elaborate manuscript, and they don't want to scrap it and do the whole thing because they realize they've missed a word. So you have a man and an animal in the right margin transporting that word to the proper place rather than redoing the whole page. But again, if they edited and figured out that they missed a word, they had to get that word in there somehow, even if they thought of a creative way to do it. But there was respect for biblical authority every step of the way, driving this process and copies of copies and so on. There's a general tendency to be careful and respectful of the text, no additions, no deletions, no tampering, no alterations. Primary focus on the sacredness of the text itself without drawing attention to peripheral issues. You have the text. In fact, you look at the earliest copies of the New Testament, you do have some peripheral things going on in the tangible material evidence and the remains there. But some of the earlier manuscripts are kind of boring to look at because it's just the text. And if you don't read Greek, then you're looking at words on a page. But when you get into the Middle Ages and the Roman Catholic Church begins to take over the whole enterprise, it's kind of like the difference between meeting in a humble church meeting place versus walking into an elaborate medieval cathedral. You have a lot of style over substance all of a sudden as you get into the later manuscripts. Look at the Irish Book of Kells, copy of which is back there, dating from about 800 AD. That is not a personal Bible. It was never intended to be. It's an Irish national treasure, but it's elaborate, it's beautiful to look at externally, but it was never intended as a personal reading Bible of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So you see that tendency that tends to kick in as you get into the Middle Ages. In the earliest manuscripts, it was not style over substance, but that's not necessarily true when you get into the Middle Ages. The point we made yesterday, we can reconstruct the original text with near 100% accuracy, and no doctrine is at stake there. You do have an additional quality control measure that existed during the Roman Empire period and into the Middle Ages, and I need to mention this. You have these communal reading events. I did mention those. And not everybody could read. And even in church, you would have a reader and people would internalize the word through their ears as that reader would read. That would be how they read in many cases. So these communal reading events were widespread, done all the time, done in synagogues, obviously, with the Torah or the Old Law, and in churches with the New Testament as well as the Old Testament. But in terms of checks and balances, quality control, and all that, the text was not fluid. How do we know that wholesale changes of the text were not made during this period, as copies of these manuscripts were being made? And I made the point yesterday, the decentralization of the text is one of those checks and balances, because no one institution could rein in all the manuscripts that were floating around everywhere. Both in the East and the West, you have the Eastern Orthodox scribes copying text as well, and the Western Roman Catholic scribes, or Western Roman Catholic hierarchy didn't control those scribes. So the text was not fluid, but Jerome translated the Latin, the New Testament and the Old Testament into what we call the Latin Vulgate. It was a new Latin version. There had been an old Latin version translated very early on from the Hebrew Old Testament and the Greek New Testament. And that old Latin version was commonly used in the Roman Empire among those who spoke Latin. So Augustine, famous theologian into the 4th century, into the early 5th century, very famous theologian. He had an influence over Catholicism and later on Calvinism. Disagree with a lot of his theology, but he was very influential. And he overlapped with Jerome, the translator. So Jerome translates this newfangled Latin version, which becomes the Latin Vulgate, which is eventually entrenched, becomes the translation in Roman Catholicism. And it was relatively new. It was right off, people were just copying it for the first time. And so Augustine's down there in Africa, and he writes a letter to Jerome about the reactions to his new Latin Vulgate translation. And he said that when one word differed from the Old Latin in Jonah 4:6, one word, there was an uproar in the congregation. They caught the one word that was different in the New Latin versus the Old Latin. Do you think for a moment that the Roman Catholic Church then could take that and just make wholesale changes without people being aware of that? Without an uproar occurring? You think again. This is one more quality control measure that we don't normally think about. People knew the text, and they wanted to know the text word for word. You introduce one new word, and they're going to be aware of that. So as we've made the point already, the decentralization of the text is a guarantee that no central bureaucracy could control or alter the message. The revealed word was primary, not the church as a validating institution. And as the medieval church, the medieval age persisted, there was a shift in emphasis from the power of the Roman Catholic bureaucracy away from individual engagement with the Word. So you have a period of time that is romanticized, and we think about the cathedrals, castles, the cobblestone streets, the knights in shining armor. My German wife has taken me to the cathedral in Cologne, near where she grew up. It's gigantic. I can't even, pictures don't even do it justice, but you stand next to that thing and it just, or you walk inside and you're looking up forever and ever, it seems like. It's just extremely impressive that people way back then could build something like this. or the Cathedral of Notre Dame before it burned down. And a few years ago, several parts of it at least burned. The Loire Valley and the castles there, and me with a Golden State Warriors cap trying to tame a knight in Amboise, France, old medieval area, or Rothenburg, Germany, which is an ancient town with walled medieval walls, and a medieval crime museum. We think of the romanticized version of the Middle Ages, but we have to remember this was a brutal age, the age of inquisitions, the age in which people, you talk about cancel culture. They understood cancel culture really well in the Middle Ages. And in this medieval crime museum, they had all kinds of instruments of torture reserved for people that took issue with the Roman Catholic Church, for example. And this is the only picture of my wife that I'll slip in here. You could just see that she's under terrible torture right here. Just terrible, terrible torture. But I wouldn't want to go down in the dunk and have to face that kind of, or this nice, comfortable, cushioned seat. That it was a brutal period of time, and we think of it in these terms, with all the medieval pictures and the beautiful manuscripts, some of which are replicated back there. There were gospel books. There's beautiful manuscript art. There are books depicting the scenes in Revelation. I've got a couple in the display area, and scribes working their fingers to the bone, copying the text over and over again in scriptoria, in Roman Catholic monasteries. Beautiful works of art that were produced in that time. And even pictures that replicate pictures out of books from the late antiquity age, including this one in the Codex Amiatitis with supposedly Ezra the scribe, and you have a modern-looking cupboard with different volumes of the sections of the Bible. I want to mention one other thing that should not be neglected, and it's hardly ever mentioned in connection with the preservation of the text. And in fact, I'll mention two things. One is more minor, but it's something to look for when you go back to the exhibit area, is that from the 4th century onward, you have this idea that the 4 Gospels are representative or parallel in some way to the 4 facial images of the beasts, or not the beast, but the cherubim in Ezekiel. So from a very early period, you have Matthew associated with the face of a man because of Jesus appearing as the Son of Man. From a very early period, you have Mark associated with the cherubim face of a lion, because the opening words of Mark allude to the voice crying in the wilderness, John the Baptist, and that was associated with a lion's roar. And then you have Luke associated with an ox, a beast of burden, because Jesus comes as a suffering servant bearing the burdens of others. And then you have the Gospel of John like an eagle, because it just soars majestically. And so as you look at the medieval gospel book replicas back there, and even into the early printed editions, of the English Bibles, you'll see on the opening page of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, face of a man, a lion, ox, and an eagle. Look, you might just wade through some of those pages, and you'll see that consistently from the 400s or 500s all the way into the 1500s in virtually all of those books. So it's kind of an interesting thing to notice. But here's another one, hardly ever talked about, but more apropos to the point. You have Eusebian canons devised by Eusebius of Caesarea, who is a famous church historian. Much of what we know about the first 3 centuries of the church is because he wrote a book on church history, and we still have access to it. The other thing that he bequeathed to us is 10 canon tables for parallel passages in the 4 Gospels. They didn't have chapter and verse divisions, and so how could you compare a section of Matthew to a section of Mark to a section of Luke to a section of John? And Eusebius devised a way of doing that, and so you have these tables in the front of the medieval gospel books, and you look at the first few pages before you get to Matthew, and you have these 10 tables. And then in the margins of the text, in the margins, you have numbers going back to the canon tables. So it was a cross-referencing system. Table 1 has episodes that are in all 4 Gospels. Tables 2 through 9, episodes common to 2 or 3 of the Gospels. And then table 10, episodes unique to just one Gospel. They're just in Matthew or Mark or Luke or John. And this devised a way of cross-referencing parallel accounts prior to modern chapter and verse divisions. And every event of Jesus in the 4 Gospels is in every paragraph. Every event is keyed to one of these numbers in the Eusebian canons. So this is what they look like, and you could see this in the display area at the very beginning of the gospel accounts, and even into a couple of the printed editions, the very beginning, or at least the Latin one from 1546 has this. You have these Eusebian canon tables. This is what they look like. And you see this throughout the Middle Ages. And even into this printed version that is back there from 1546. So, and you even have, even though the tables no longer exist, if they did exist in the Codex Sinaiticus, those pages have been lost. But the side margins still contain the Eusebian canon numbers from the 4th century, and you see this throughout the Middle Ages, all the way to the earliest printed versions of the Bible. So, if someone says, the Catholic Church came in and they just messed with the Gospels and changed the whole thing around. No, they didn't. The Eusebian canon tables are fairly consistent throughout this whole period. No one talks about that, but it's one more peg that guarantees the authenticity of the transmission of these episodes down through this whole period. No one messed with the Gospels. And so even in the earliest printed copies, you have those Eusebian tables and then the number system on the side margin. The chapter and verse divisions didn't come till later on. Chapter divisions by Stephen Langton, Archbishop of Canterbury in 1228. He's also largely the impetus behind the Magna Carta, very famous. And then the verse divisions in 1551 by Robert Estienne, Robert Stephanus. And prior to 1551, even William Tyndale didn't have verse divisions. So he would speak of Matthew 5a or Matthew 5c, or the major division, the paragraphs in the text. And you had to find the actual section because you didn't have the verses yet. Those were assigned later on. So John Wycliffe comes along, and in the 1380s, heads a team that translates the Bible into English from the Latin Vulgate. It wasn't from the original Greek or the Hebrew, but it was from the Latin Vulgate. And the Catholic Church didn't like that. And John Wycliffe, even though he was a Catholic, didn't like certain things about the Catholic Church. He died a Catholic, but he was a reformer before the Reform started, the Reformation. And so you have Catholics that wanted to ban or burn what he produced. But these Bibles were produced with obvious care, written on vellum to last, generally free from additional matter, and nothing to identify the translator, the place of origin, or the date. And you have a number of individual books that people carried around. And he's known as the Morning Star of Morning Star of the Reformation for a reason. Henry Knighton, a Catholic chronicler, did not have a high opinion of that translation. Christ gave his gospel to the clergy, to the learned doctors of the church, so that they might give it to the laity and to the weaker persons according to the message of the season and personal need. But this Master John Wycliffe translated the gospel from Latin into the English, the Angle, not the angel language. And Wycliffe, by thus translating the Bible, made it the property of the masses and common to all and more open to the laity and even to women who were able to read. Can you imagine that? And so the pearl of the gospel is thrown before swine and trodden underfoot, and what is meant to be the treasure both of clergy and laity now has become a joke of both. That's what the Roman Catholic Church thought about translating the Bible into the common vernacular. We should never forget. So he died a Catholic, but 44 years after his death, his body was exhumed, his remains were burned, and his ashes were scattered over the River Swift. And this is from John Fox's Acts and Monuments, which is also back in the display area. You could actually see that very woodcut. It spawned a movement in the 15th century, the 1400s, called the Lollards, which probably means ranters. But they became very common. You have poor preachers, and they thought of themselves as a network of true Christians. They held their own illegal conventicles, which were assemblies, mostly at night, memorizing the Bible in English, which was commonly looked upon as illegal. And they came to some interesting conclusions, by and large, and there's a range among the Lollards, but by and large, these are some general conclusions. No images, no expensive buildings endorsed, no holy days, no confession to a priest, no allegiance to the Pope, no prayers for the dead, no infant baptism, no Latin Mass, and even no musical instruments. Where did they get that? There's a William Thorpe that was tried by Bishop Arundel and asked about that very issue. And again, it's in the Acts and Monuments books that are back there. He was asked whether he approved of instruments of music in worship, and he said no. Why not? And he used an argument I would never use, but he said when Jesus went into the home of Jairus to heal his daughter, to raise her from the dead, he put out the minstrels. And so, that's not an argument I would use, but it's one that he used. It's interesting they would come to that conclusion, though, just reading the Bible. They didn't want all the ornate externals of the Roman Catholic Church. Well, you do have a game changer. You have a lot of suppression of truth going on during this period. You have inquisitions, trials of those who took a different view. But this disruptive technology of the day occurs when Johann Gutenberg in Mainz, Germany, comes up with this movable type printing press. And again, this is not far from where Andrea grew up, so she's taken me there many times. We've gone to that museum. And speaking of Folsom, my good friend who preaches there in California, David Posey, went on a trip with us one time. We went through mines. We weren't supposed to take a picture of the printing press, but he's a photographer, and he sneaked one, and so that I'm going to blame David Posey on that picture in the middle. But the first book that came off the printing press was the Latin Vulgate, Jerome's translation. And a lot of interesting things about that I can say. Gutenberg Bible. He printed about 30 Bibles on vellum, which is treated parchment leather, and about 150 on expensive Italian paper. They were 17 by 24 and a half inches when open flat, so big sheets of paper. And the 30 Bibles on vellum alone required 5,000 calf skins. Imagine how expensive that would have been if you were to kind of put that into modern dollars. And so his first 9 pages had 40 lines. The next several pages had 41, and then the rest of the book had 42 lines, which gave rise to the phrase 42-line Bible. But his motivation was this: God suffers in the multitude of souls whom his word cannot reach. Religious truth is imprisoned in a small number of manuscript books, which confine instead of spreading the public treasure. Let us break the seal which seals up holy things and give wings to truth, in order that she may go and win every soul that comes into this world by her word, no longer written by at great expense by a hand easily palsied, but multiplied like the wind by an untiring machine. Yes, it is a press, certainly, but a press from which shall soon flow in inexhaustible streams the most abundant and most marvelous liquor that has ever flowed to relieve the thirst of men. Through it, God will spread his word. A spring of pure truth shall flow from it. Like a new star, it shall scatter the darkness of ignorance and cause a light heretofore unknown to shine among men. In the year 2000, there was analysis about the most important historical figures of the previous 1,000 years. And on one list, at least, Johann Gutenberg was listed number 1 in influence because of the printing press and what it did as a disruptive game changer. So you have printed copies of the text, and the first Greek text printed was the Complutensian Polyglot, and there's a copy of that back in the back. This brings the era of the Greek manuscripts, handwritten pages, to an end, because the Greek and the Latin were then printed out, and no longer a need for a hand easily palsied. And so that was 1514. Just a few years after that, Erasmus produces his Greek text. Martin Luther and William Tyndale translate from the German and the English from Erasmus's Greek text of the New Testament. And even Erasmus, interesting figure, he was too Catholic to leave the Catholic Church, and so he remained in the system. And because of that, because he didn't operate outside the system, he was not as influential as some of these reformers. But he did hope and wish that the Bible would be translated into the common tongue, common vernacular. I wish that they were translated into all the languages of all people, that they might be read and known, not merely by the Scotch and the Irish, but even by the Turks and the Saracens. I wish that the husbandman may sing parts of them at his plow, that the weaver may warble them at the shuttle, that the traveler may with their narratives beguile the weariness of the way. And so he would not be as influential simply because, again, he remained a Roman Catholic. And Someone said Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched, and Erasmus responded that he expected quite another kind of bird. He didn't appreciate Luther, but he opened the door, so to speak. So you have, again, this is the 1546 Latin translation. It's a Roman Catholic Bible from Lyon, France, and quite beautiful. It has the Eusebian canon tables, but there's this immense pent-up hunger for the Bible because the Roman Catholics had filtered it. And you have the stained glass windows, and you had the Passion plays, and you have the preaching of the friar and Dominican monks. But there's this pent-up desire to just get to the Bible in the original context and be able to engage with it, even the common people. And so you have quotes like this one: I used to think that I had penetrated to the depths of your truth with the citizens of your heaven, until you, the solid truth, shone upon me in your scriptures, scattering the cloud of my error and showing me how I was croaking in the marshes with the toads and frogs. Love that quotation. People wanted the Bible. They wanted to engage with it. They wanted to hold it. They wanted to read it for themselves without layers and layers and layers of intermediary interpretations or in bits and pieces given to them by the Roman Catholic hierarchy. They wanted just to have it and to be able to engage in open investigation for themselves. And so you have the Inquisitions as people begin to honestly question the prevailing narrative. And many people paid a price for that with some of those instruments of torture we looked at earlier. And then finally, there comes a monk who was the right man in the right place at the right time in Wittenberg, Germany. And Johannes Tetzel had sold indulgences there, which gave rise to the saying, as the coin in the coffer rings, so the soul from purgatory springs. Luther called it the pious defrauding of the faithful. The conflict came to a head on October 31st, 1517, and he nailed 95 theses to the castle church door of Wittenberg, Germany. Pope Leo X moved to quench a monk, Martin Luther by name, and thus smother the fire before it should become a conflagration. He called Luther a wild boar who had invaded the Lord's vineyard. And as events of the burgeoning Reformation played out, it was a losing battle for the Roman Catholics. They were never going to win this one. There was just this pent-up pressure that just blew. Everybody wanted to read and engage with the Bible themselves, or at least a whole lot of people. And so the interesting thing is you have a counter-reformation to try to squelch this thing. Ignatius Loyola, founder of the Jesuit order, was one of the leaders of that counter-revolution. He defended the powers that be. He defended the suppression of open investigation. And what epitomizes that effort is his statement, "I will believe that the white object I see is black if that should be the decision of the hierarchical church." On the other hand was this defiant German monk, Martin Luther, who said, "A simple layman armed with Scripture is to be believed above a pope or a cardinal without it." Two very different attitudes. But the greatest thing Martin Luther did is he translated the Bible into his native German. He said in 1521, "Unless I can be instructed and convinced with evidence from the Holy Scriptures, then I cannot and will not recant, because it is neither safe nor wise to act against conscience. Here I stand, I can do no other. So help me God. Amen." I'll tell you what, I don't agree with all of his theology, but I will say this: every generation needs people with that kind of courage, including this generation. The greatest thing that he did is put the Bible back into the hands of the common people. He taught the priesthood of all believers, and he opened the door to religious freedom and the spirit of open investigation. On the downside, he fought one theological extreme by going too far to the other theological extreme, a faith alone theology. He adamantly denied free will, and he retained many Catholic practices. And even though he gave at least lip service to his fellow Lutherans or fellow believers not calling themselves Lutherans, you have in 1531 an Augsburg Confession, which solidified the Lutheran Church, the beginning of the first Protestant denomination. In the next hour, we're going to talk about this contemporary of Luther, who is lesser well known, William Tyndale. And there was no Tyndalian church. And he was a lot closer to the truth on several issues than Luther was. But we'll look at that in the next hour. Just want to make a few concluding observations. Number one, the Roman Catholic Church did not produce the Bible, they suppressed it. But they did allow monks to copy the Scriptures, and we're deeply indebted to them for that, at least. The hunger for the Bible was intense, especially in its original context, and eventually there was no stopping the inevitable. This was going to happen. There was just too much gravity in that direction. It was bound to happen, and it did.